Good day everyone. So today I'm going to report about the chapter 7, which is the history of women's writing by Helen Carr. So Helen Carr is a historian, a writer, a journalist, and an emeritus professor of English and comparative literature at the Goldsmith University of London. So her concern with this chapter is the feminist literary critics, gradual rediscovery and re-evaluation of women's writing during the 2 decades that followed the eruption of feminist protest, and also the reason why the pioneer feminist writers' focus was elsewhere in order to situate the political moment out of which that quest for rediscovery. So when feminist literary criticism began to emerge in the late 60s and early 70s, bursting into prominence with the publication of such provocative and influential texts as Kate Millet's Sexual Politics on 1971, Germaine Greer's The Female Eunuch on 1970, and Eva Fige's Patriarchal Attitude on 1970, so these pioneering polemics gave surprisingly little attention to women's writing. So considering that they are a feminist writers, but surprisingly, they only give a little attention to women's writing. So when we say polemics, so it means a strong verbal or written attack to someone. So as Mary Eagleton has pointed out in the previous chapter, so she said that they almost solely concern with men. So these three feminist writers, namely Kate Millett, Germaine Greer, and Eva Figes, uses a tactic wherein they focus more about men than women writings. So though they are criticizing works written by men, but some of their remarks about women author are somewhat belittling and offensive for women, which seems supporting to the view of women's stereotypes. So just like what Millett or Kate Millett said to Virginia Woolf's Dalloway, so she said that the characters Mrs. Dalloway and Mrs. Ramsay is argumentative yet somehow unsuccessful. Another is what she said to Charlotte Bronte's Villette, so which she described that the book was or as occasionally flowed by mawkish nonsense. So when we say mawkish nonsense, so it means it lacks of flavor or it is exaggerated and childishly emotional. So at this period also, so this only a handful women writers made it into the university English courses. So next is the influence of civil rights movements to the feminist writers. So in the States, the civil rights movements played a significant role in alerting those who emerge as feminists to their own lack of rights. So the women's liberation movement quite consciously named itself by analogy with the anti-colonial national liberation movement around the world. So this movement could serve as a model of resistance. So this movement really opened the eyes and the mind of the female writers to fight for their right. So one example is Juliette Michel, who deeply involved in the New Left. So when we say New Left, so it is also a movement which aimed to achieve the equal rights. So Juliette Michel was deeply involved in the New Left, and its support for those nationalistic and anti-imperialistic struggles has recalled how she gradually became conscious about women's experiences. So, on another hand, Germaine Greer summed up the new movement with her Female Eunuch. So, contrasting the second wave feminism with the suffragette movement, she writes that then Gentel middle-class ladies clamored for reform, now Ungentel middle-class women are recalling for revolution. So for many of them, the call for revolution came before the call for the liberation of women. So the New Left has been the forcing house for most movements, and for many of them, liberation is dependent on the coming of the classless society and the withering away of the state. So, yet for all her fighting talk, so after all what she say to uplift women as a feminist writer, so Germaine Greer was at this stage belittling the women's work like Millet, just like Kate Millet. So Mary Ellman, on the other hand, who's an elegant critic of misogynistic stereotype, is the only work of American feminist criticism to be praised by Toril Moy, who writes more about women writers than the other three. So she too rebukes them for accepting and reproducing stereotypes of women much as male writers do, conniving in their own oppression. Feminists would soon, however, to be finding other and more positive things to say about women writers. So let's proceed to the turn to women's writing. So Elman said that and pointed out and makes clear that even if she had criticism to make, she was reading both earlier and contemporary women writers with some avidity, and she suggests that the dissipation of authoritative norms in literary form as in society as a whole was creating new possibilities for women writing. So the 60s had in fact seen as an impressive wave of imaginative writing by women who were already questioning women's role and relationship between men and women. So for example was Doris Lessing, which brought out her highly influential The Golden Notebook in 1962 and completed her autobiographical five-volume Martha Quest series and Children of Violence in 1966. Another example is Sylvia Plath's novel which is The Bell Jar, which came out in 1963, and another example is Jean Rhys, which most famous book, her prequel to Jane Eyre, Wide Sargasso Sea, was published in 1966. So not all these writers consider themselves as feminists because they are not only focusing and concerned with women's problem, but they also explored issues such as colonialism, race, class, political oppression, and mental illness. Besides, so these writers, there was a range of women publishing in the 60s. So, as Margaret Drabble was to comment in 1973, so according to her, that the large amount of fiction written by women in the last decade bears witness that a lot of women started to worry about the same things at the same time and turn fiction to express their anxieties. So, although the degree to which they were explicitly engaged in the questioning of gender varied, there is no doubt that these writers helped to make it possible for their women readers to recognize the dilemmas for their own lives and to make feminist theory thinkable. So, as the women's movement developed in the 70s, so and feminist focus moved from attacking patriarchy to the task that Greer had urged for them liberating themselves, women's writing, both contemporary and from the past, would be increasingly drawn upon to interpret and articulate feminist women's concerns. So as early as 1973, in response to this new interest, so the feminist publishing house Virago was founded in London, concentrating on publishing out-of-print women's writing. So another is the Women's Press, followed in 1978, and the Pandura in 1983. So in the States, the Feminist Press was launched in the early 70s, and there two other publishers specializing in women's writing followed. So during these times, the publishing house and press for women's writing are emerging. So Elaine Showalter would later call it the genocriticism, or the criticism that focus on literature by women, emerge as a ground-up movement. So, in 1972, Rowbottom published Women, Resistance, Revolution, and in 1973, The Hidden from History, 300 Years of Women's Oppression and the Struggle Against It. So, this book brings a different way of looking at women from that of Millet and Greer's early work, and one that would migrate into feminist literary criticism. So, there was the reoccupation of women omitted from standard male dominated accounts, and on the other, a consciousness not just of women's oppression, but also the degree to which women resisted and challenged their position. So, feminists were finding a new value and significance in women's work, as well as using it to understand their own dilemmas in the contemporary world. So, feminist studies of women writing gradually began to appear in the early 70s, to start with largely focusing on the 19th century. So, the book which literary women is often paired is Elaine Sholter's A Literature of Their Own, appeared in 1977, introducing a further range of forgotten or neglected writers, in particular the sensation novelist Mary Braddon and Mrs. Henry Wood, and the new women Sarah Grand, Mona Caird, and George Egerton. So, a women's literary tradition. So, none of those early feminist critics had implied women lacked the talent to write well, but only the opportunity, given their lack of economic independence, lack of status, and lack of time. Now, however, the emphasis moved from their difficulties to how much they had achieved in spite of these obstacles on their way. Feminist studies of women writing gradually began to appear in the early 70s, to start with largely focusing on the 19th century. So one of the first book-length works to come out was Patricia Mayer's Sparks, The Female Imagination on 1975. So on her prologue, so she explains about how her students, or what is the view of her students when it comes to written works by women. So she said that they felt that to read books by women would have direct personal meaning for them. So she assumes that one can make generalization about women as a whole. So the book opens with a question: what are the ways of female feelings, the modes of responding, and that persist in spite of social change? And she goes to assert that changing social condition increase or diminish the opportunities for women action and expression, but a special female self-awareness emerges through literature in every period. So, Spack's book was followed by Ellen Moore's Literary Women. So, according to Moore's, literature is the only intellectual field to which women over a long stretch of time have made an indispensable contribution. So, the book contained an influential chapter on the then neglected field of the female Gothic, in which Mowers wrote about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein as a myth of genuine originality forged out of her responses to the hideously intermixed experience of death and birth through which she was living at the time of its writing. So next is Towards a Black and Lesbian Feminist Criticism. So Showalter's write that she obviously thinks that the identities of being black and female are mutually exclusive, as this statement illustrates. Furthermore, there are other literary subcultures such as Black American novelists, for example, whose history offers a precedent for feminist scholarship to use. The idea of critics like Showalter using black literature is chilling, a case of barely disguised cultural imperialism. So in America, one may expect that the new women's movement to ally itself on an equal basis with blacks and students in a growing radical coalition. So, as the largest alienation element in our society, and because of their numbers, passion, and length of oppression, its largest revolution based women might to play a leadership part in social revolution quite unknown before in history. So the changes in fundamental values such as coalition of exploited groups, blacks, youth women, the poor, would seek are especially towards freedom from rank or perspective, roles, sexual or otherwise. So in places such as America, so there is a long time issue about the oppression on black peoples, especially on the black women. So since then, so black society is seeking for the equal rights. So up until now, we know that there are still um, black people that receive a discrimination, especially on the places like U.S. So by the late 70s, to neglect a non-white women writers was undoubtedly to fail to respond to some of the most striking writing of the time. So Adrienne Rich, who talks of a lesbian continuum of women, that the American lesbian criticism, like American feminism in general, was often seen by black feminists as racist in its exclusively white interest. True, it had a fact, she says, been much influenced by black lesbian critics. So next is subverting the law of the father. So as the 70s drew to a close, so the political climate was changing. The revolutionary fervor of the 60s mutated into a Reaganite and Thatcherite 80s, and the buoyant confidence of the ambiental middle-class women invoked by Greer that liberation would be swiftly achieved was now muted. In spite of the growth of the women movement, resistance seems, if anything, harder through just an essential and feminist discussion of women writing would reflect that sense of struggle. So Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubars, The Mad Woman in the Attic in 1979, another book that came out of a college course in women's literature, has been seen in many ways as continuing the tradition of Spax, Mowers, and Showalter. So it was a highly influential text, a good deal of its appeal lying in its repeated heroic tale of women writers battling for self-creation against an overwhelming powerful patriarchal authority. So chapter after chapter traces their hard-won success against the odds. So feminist literary criticism in the 80s became more diverse, more sophisticated, and more wide-ranging, but also more divided. So during the 80s, so there is still a continuing excitement about women's writing outside the academy. So reading by women's writers was growing, and the International Feminist Book Fair was founded, and conferences were organized on women's writing. So books in which contemporary women writers talk about their own experience of creating text became increasingly popular, and publishers lists like Penguin Lives of Modern Women and Virago's Pioneers celebrated women writers' achievement in a range of fields. So feminist magazines of the period on both sides of the Atlantic, like Miss Women's Review of Books, Spare Rib, Women's Review, and the Every Woman, published interviews with women writers as well as reviews of their work, and books which collected interviews with women writers to appear. So the range of writers that women were reading continued to grow. So that's all. Thank you.